The blood on her dress was still wet when they found her. Elijah Thornton hadn't let anyone into his world for 4 years, not since the fever took his wife and turned his heart to stone. But his daughters were dragging him toward the creek, toward a dying woman whose dark eyes held secrets he couldn't ignore. One decision: shelter her or leave her to die. He chose wrong. Or maybe he chose right. Because the Sioux woman lying half dead against that cottonwood tree was about to shatter everything he'd built to protect himself from feeling, from living, from loving again. Some strangers don't just enter your life. They resurrect it. Elijah Thornton hadn't smiled in 4 years. Not since the fever took Sarah, leaving him alone with 2 daughters and a ranch that stretched across the Wyoming wilderness like an empty promise. At 42, his hands were weathered from rope and leather, his face carved by wind and silence. The Bighorn Mountains loomed in the distance, their snow-capped peaks reflecting the same coldness that had settled into his chest. 15-year-old Nora had learned to read her father's moods, in the tightness of his jaw, the way he avoided looking at the family portrait above the fireplace. Her sister Clara, 12 and still hopeful, tried desperately to resurrect the man their mother had loved. But Elijah had perfected the art of presence without participation, feeding cattle, mending fences, existing without truly living. The September afternoon was dying when Nora burst through the door, her face flushed with urgency. "Papa, you need to come, now." Elijah looked up from the saddle he was oiling, irritation flickering across his features. "What is it?" "There's a woman, down by Miller's Creek. She's hurt." Something in his daughter's voice, a tremor of genuine fear, made him rise. He grabbed his rifle out of habit, a remnant of caution from years when territory disputes meant survival. Clara was already outside, holding the reins of 2 horses, her small frame vibrating with nervous energy. They rode hard toward the creek, autumn leaves crunching beneath hooves. What Elijah found made him pull his horse up short. A woman lay against a cottonwood tree, her deerskin dress torn and bloodied, black hair matted with dirt and what looked like dried blood. Her skin was bronze in the fading light, her features distinctly Native American. Sioux, he guessed from the beadwork on her moccasins. "We can't just leave her," Nora said, defiance already forming in her voice. Elijah's first instinct was refusal. Complications, questions from neighbors. But looking at his daughters' faces, so much like Sarah's when she'd insisted on feeding every drifter who passed through, he felt something crack inside his carefully constructed isolation. "Get her on my horse," he said finally, "but she stays in the barn until we know she's not dangerous." The woman drifted in and out of consciousness for 2 days. Elijah had set her up in the barn's tack room on a clean cot with blankets Sarah had sewn years ago. The irony wasn't lost on him, his dead wife's handiwork now covering a stranger who represented everything he'd tried to keep at arm's length. Nora appointed herself the woman's caretaker, cleaning the gash on her head and the bruises on her ribs with a gentleness that reminded Elijah painfully of Sarah. Clara brought water and soup, chattering nervously to fill the silence. "What do you think happened to her?" Clara asked on the 3rd morning, watching their patient sleep. "Fall from a horse, maybe," Elijah muttered, though the pattern of bruises suggested otherwise. Someone had beaten her, left her to die. When the woman finally woke, her dark eyes were alert, assessing. She flinched when Elijah entered, her hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. "Easy," he said, keeping his distance. "My daughters found you by the creek. You're safe here." She studied him for a long moment before speaking, her English accented but clear. "Why help me?" It was a fair question, one he'd been asking himself. "Because they insisted," he said, nodding toward Nora and Clara hovering in the doorway. "I am Winona," she said quietly, "of the Oglala Lakota. Elijah Thornton. This is my land." Something passed between them, an understanding that this arrangement was temporary, transactional, nothing more. But over the following days, as Winona regained her strength, Elijah found himself drawn to the barn more often than necessary. She was different from any woman he'd known, direct, unafraid of silence, with a stillness that felt like strength rather than submission. "You carry great sadness," she observed one evening when he brought her dinner. It wasn't a question. Elijah stiffened. "You don't know anything about me." "I know the look of a man who has forgotten how to live." Her eyes held no judgment, only recognition. "I know because I wore that face once." He wanted to walk away, to retreat into his familiar fortress of grief. Instead, he heard himself asking, "What happened to you, before the creek?" Winona's jaw tightened. "My husband. He did not approve of my wish to leave." She touched her ribs gently. "So he made sure I understood his disapproval." The violence in her words hung between them. Elijah understood then. They were both refugees from different kinds of loss. October brought early snow to the Bighorns, and Winona was well enough to move from the barn to the small guest room Sarah had once used for sewing. The transition felt monumental to Elijah, as if he were betraying some unspoken vow to keep the house frozen in time. But the girls were happier than he'd seen them in years. Winona taught them to identify medicinal plants, to track deer by broken twigs and disturbed earth, to read weather in the behavior of birds. She moved through the house with quiet efficiency, never presuming but somehow making everything feel more alive. One evening, Elijah found her in the kitchen, grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle. The lamplight caught the sharp planes of her face, the silver threads in her black hair. She couldn't be much younger than him, he realized. Mid-30s, perhaps. "For Clara's cough," Winona explained, noticing his gaze. "Wild cherry bark and honey." "You don't have to," he began. "I know." She continued grinding. "But your daughters have shown me kindness. I repay debts. You don't owe us anything." She looked up then, her eyes meeting his with unsettling directness. "Then perhaps I do this because I wish to." Something in her tone made his pulse quicken. He'd forgotten that feeling, the awareness of another person's presence, the electricity of possibility. Guilt immediately followed. Sarah had been gone 4 years, but moving forward felt like abandonment. As if reading his thoughts, Winona said softly, "The dead do not want us to die with them, Elijah. They want us to honor them by living fully." "How do you know what the dead want?" The words came out harsher than he intended. "Because I spent 2 years wishing to join my daughter in the spirit world after sickness took her." Winona's voice remained steady, but he saw the tremor in her hands. "Every day I prayed for death, until one morning I saw a butterfly emerge from its chrysalis. It struggled. It seemed impossible, but it emerged, beautiful and free." She met his eyes. "That is when I understood. Transformation is painful, but it is also sacred." Elijah felt something break inside him, a dam he'd built stone by careful stone. His eyes burned and he turned away before she could see. "Your wife," Winona continued quietly, "would she want you to stop living?" "No," he whispered. "Sarah would have hated this, what I've become." "Then perhaps it is time to become something new." The first real test came on a Sunday when Elijah took Winona into town for supplies. He told himself it was practical. She needed proper clothes for the coming winter, boots that fit. But he knew the truth. He was making a choice, a statement. Sheridan, Wyoming was a small town where everyone knew everyone's business. The stares started immediately. Mrs. Patterson clutched her purse tighter. The Reverend's wife whispered to her companions. At the general store, the proprietor's smile died when he saw Winona. "We don't serve Indians here," he said flatly. Elijah felt rage rise, hot and sudden. "Then you don't serve me either." He took Winona's arm. "Come on." Outside she touched his hand briefly. "You do not have to fight my battles." "I'm not fighting yours. I'm fighting mine." The clarity of it surprised him. For years he'd been a ghost, avoiding conflict, avoiding everything. But standing up felt like breathing after being underwater. These people, they don't know you. They don't know anything. They found what they needed at a smaller store on the edge of town, run by an old German immigrant who nodded respectfully at Winona and asked her opinion on medicinal teas. Driving home, Elijah felt lighter than he had in years. That night, a group of men rode onto his property. He recognized Tom Barrett, a neighboring rancher known for his hatred of Native Americans, and 3 of his hands. Elijah met them on the porch, rifle in hand. "Heard you're harboring an Indian woman, Thornton," Barrett called out. "Heard wrong. I'm hosting a guest. That squaw belongs—" "Finish that sentence and we'll have a problem." Elijah's voice was steel. Barrett's horse shifted nervously. "You think about your daughters, Elijah, about what people might think." "I am thinking about my daughters. I'm teaching them that character matters more than prejudice. Now get off my land." The men left, but the threat lingered like smoke. Inside, Winona stood at the window, Nora and Clara beside her. All 3 women looked at him with something he hadn't seen in years: pride. "You did not have to do that," Winona said. "Yes, I did." Elijah set the rifle down. "I've spent 4 years hiding from life, from feeling anything." "You were right. Sarah would have hated what I became. She would have welcomed you. She would have stood up to Barrett." He looked at Winona, really looked at her. "You've reminded me who I used to be, who I want to be again." Winter came hard and fast, blanketing the ranch in white silence, but inside the Thornton house, something had shifted. Laughter returned, hesitant at first, then genuine. Elijah taught Winona to ride Western style. She taught him traditional Lakota songs. The girls bloomed under the attention of 2 adults who were learning to live again. On Christmas Eve, Elijah found Winona outside, watching snow fall over the bighorns. He'd been working up courage for weeks, terrified and hopeful in equal measure. "I need to tell you something," he said, his breath clouding in the cold air. She turned, her expression open, waiting. "When Sarah died, I thought I died too. The part of me that could feel, that could hope, I buried it with her." The words came easier than expected. "But you've shown me that healing isn't betrayal, that loving again doesn't diminish what I had before." "Elijah, I'm not asking for anything. I just need you to know that you've given me something I thought was impossible. You've given me back my life." Winona stepped closer, her hand finding his. "You gave me sanctuary when I had none. Safety when I expected only violence. You and your daughters showed me that family is not only blood, it is choice." Her eyes glistened. "I choose this. I choose you, if you will have me." He pulled her close, and for the first time in 4 years, Elijah Thornton felt whole. Not because another person completed him, but because he'd finally allowed himself to heal, to transform, to live. Inside, through the frosted window, Nora and Clara watched their father embrace Winona, both girls grinning through happy tears. "Mom would have liked her," Clara whispered. "Yeah," Nora agreed. "She really would have." The snow continued falling, covering old wounds with fresh white promise. In the distance, the Bighorn Mountains stood eternal, witnessing the quiet miracle of 2 broken souls becoming whole together, not through magic or destiny, but through the simple, sacred courage of opening closed hearts. Spring would come, life would grow, and the Thornton Ranch would finally feel like home again.